I've been told a number of times that Professor Al-Azm possesses one of the foremost intellectual voices in the Middle East today. And so this is a viewpoint that we're anxious to listen to. He is currently the Emeritus Professor of European History at the University of Damascus, but he's on leave from Syria as a visiting lecturer at Princeton University, where he has taught often and for long periods of time. Professor Al-Azm's specialty is the encounter between the West and the Islamic world. He has a very strong point of view. He's known as a human rights advocate, a champion of intellectual freedom, and this has gotten him into trouble a number of times. His books are famous, they are well known, and they have been banned in many Arab countries. He has spent time in prison because of his beliefs. He has taught not only in Damascus, but also in Beirut, at Harvard University, the University of Hamburg, as well as Princeton University. He's won numerous prizes for his work. His work has been translated into 5 European languages. What he's most famous for at Brigham Young University is being the father of his son, Amr Al-Azm, and some of you have taken classes from him. He has 2 sons, 2 beautiful granddaughters, and we are blessed by their presence in Provo. So you have lightened our neighborhood. We are thankful for that. Professor Al-Azm has a lecture that times out at about 55 minutes. If you have a class and need to go, just go ahead and go quietly. But otherwise, stay for the entire lecture, and then we'll do questions as long as you're interested. Professor Al-Azm?
Thank you so much. Is this working? Good. I'm indeed very grateful for the privilege of being here, the invitation, the hospitality, and of course seeing my dear family at the same time. I find it natural that when the question of democracy in the Middle East in general and the Arab world in particular is raised and presented for discussion, debate, criticism, evaluation, and so on in the United States, I find it natural that the issue should be framed in terms of questions like, is the promotion of democracy in that part of the world good for the United States? Is democracy helpful for the security, effectiveness, and stability of the forces and regimes of moderation in the Arab world, for example? Or does democracy, even in its minimalist electoral form, likely to lead to greater insecurity, destabilization, and possible civil strife in the area, my area, as happened with, say, Hamas in the Gaza Strip after its electoral victory, as is happening in Iraq right now, and as may happen in Syria, for instance, or happen again in a place like Lebanon after the long civil war. Viewed from Damascus, this way of raising the issue makes of democracy a completely external matter to our societies and polities, and neglects it as an internal problem with its own internal dynamic, with its own internal conflicts that are currently impacting and rocking our societies and our polities. Actually, our anti-democratic governments and militaristic regimes find it very much in the interest of their security and continuity. They find it very expedient, in fact, to present the question of democracy as a purely external affair that interests the mighty foreign powers only, headed by the United States and no one else, and hence constituting, as such, a foreign threat to the overall security of the society and polity in question, as well as to its way of life in general, to its values, traditions, and so on. This society and polity could be present-day Syria, it could be present-day Iraq, or Saudi Arabia, or Tunisia, whatever. These regimes promote themselves on this matter by openly claiming and along pretty much multiculturalist lines that each society has its own natural form of democratic rule or of democratic government, so to speak, suitable to its own history, values, belief systems, structures, trajectory, etc., and need not imitate the others on this vital matter. For the more sophisticated rationalizations of this position, all this is couched in the jargon of authenticity. Cultural authenticity, social authenticity, religious authenticity, normative authenticity, and the rest. These regimes also promote themselves by implicitly claiming that their own people and societies are not really ready for something as advanced as democracy, with the added silent implication that their peoples will really never be ready for democracy at any time, at any foreseeable future. Hence, the vital need, both locally and internationally, for these regimes' continuity, stability, and even perpetuity. Here, they appeal to the traditional Arab piece of wisdom saying, كما تكونوا يولى عليكم, which means, when translated freely, your rulers are the way they are because this is how you are yourselves in the first place. So, if you are a tribal lot, then naturally your princes will be tribal sheikhs. If you are a commercial lot, then naturally your princes will be traders and merchants. And if you are a religious lot, then your princes will be mullahs, faqihs, and ayatollahs, and وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ, which translates as, this is how things are, and there is nothing you can do about it. That is, there is no breaking out of this static, vicious circle. Another piece of Arab wisdom that these regimes rely on for security and continuity says, الناس على دين ملوكها, which translates as, people follow the religion of their kings. In other words, if your kings are despotic, you will be despotic too. If your kings are democratic, you will be democratic as well. If your kings are religious fundamentalists, you will be also fundamentalists. And again, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله, which translates in this context as, until such time as God wills a change of kings or a change in the kings in themselves, you will stay as you are. That is, what cannot be humanly cured must be humanly endured. A third piece of Arab Muslim traditional political wisdom that reinforces all the above positions and arguments teaches that مئة سنة من الظلم أفضل من يوم واحد من الفتنة, which when freely translated says, enduring 100 years of injustice, tyranny, arbitrariness, and despotism is always far better than going through one day of discord, chaos, revolution, and social upheaval. These pieces of wisdom form an excellent package deal for the security and continuity of the anti-democratic, repressive status quo in practically all Arab states and countries today. The last-ditch argument by which these regimes promote themselves locally, regionally, as well as internationally, and particularly vis-à-vis the superpower, the United States in particular. This argument holds that our societies stand before a drastic choice. Either us, that is, the ruling military regimes and their martial law and or its various variants and equivalents of the martial law, or the Taliban and their Sharia law, that is, the martial law of the Islamists and the fundamentalists. A stark choice between the two. In a recent public debate in Damascus on some of these issues, I was asked bluntly by the following question. If you had to choose between the martial law of the soldiers and the martial law of the Islamists, which one would you prefer? That is, which one would you prefer to live under? I answered, assuming there were no other options available save these two options, I would prefer the martial law of the soldiers, because every day I sign petitions calling for the lifting of martial law in Syria and everywhere else in the Arab world. Who dares sign a petition calling for the lifting of Sharia law, that is God's law? Let me move on to say something about the internal dynamic of democracy in our society and politics. Viewed from Damascus, the process of tying democracy to security or vice versa is already an attack on the democratic idea itself. For security has come to mean in places like Damascus and Cairo not much more than what we call in Arabic الدولة الأمنية. That is the security state that Americans would spontaneously denounce as a police state. At the popular level, the first associations that come to mind when security is mentioned in these capitals, that is in capitals like Damascus and Cairo or Tunis, are the security services, the famous mukhabarat, the innumerable security agencies, the security of the ruling regime no matter what, and the insecurity of more or less everyone else. Thus, any mention in these capitals of such things as some respect for human rights, only some, minimally honest elections, a measure of free expression, a measure, some autonomy of civil society, and a modest amount of citizens' freedoms and rights, and no more, becomes immediately an outright attack on the security and stability of state, society, economy, fatherland, religion, the Arab Muslim system of values, and so on. Furthermore, the security treatment of democracy, human rights, citizenship, and the rest remains very much of a static approach that tends to emphasize, both knowingly and unknowingly, the rift and divide between East and West in a way that makes it look as if the serious struggles over democracy, human rights, citizenship, and so on, occur mainly and primarily between Islam and the West, Europe and the Middle East, Orient and Occident, when in fact we know now and more than ever before that the serious struggles over these principles, values and practices, institutions and arrangements are waged really inside and within societies, cultures and polities, both East and West, and not just across civilizations, cultures and states. In other words, these battles for human rights and the rest of the values connected to them, these battles are actually waged inside France, inside Germany, inside the United States, inside Turkey, inside Iran, inside the Arab world, inside China, inside Indonesia, and so on. As viewed from Damascus, the security approach seems first to lead to a reaffirmation of the cynical mentality that sees the world in the simple terms of the West versus the rest. And second, to a reaffirmation of the excuses and pretexts for which the repressors of democracy and the persecutors of free speech, the violators of human rights in the Arab world and elsewhere, reach for and successfully employ to defend and justify continuing to do what they are so good at doing anyway. Among these pretexts and excuses is a familiar argument, which in the West takes the following form when bluntly stated. Such values as free expression, religious toleration, respect for human rights are the West's deepest values from which the contemporary Muslim world, for example, is excluded on account of its own deepest cherished values, which are antithetical to the core to free expression, democracy, tolerance, human rights, secularism, and so on. On the Arab side, this argument takes the form, for example, of the necessity of protecting the security of a conveniently discovered authenticity, nativism, particularism, the sacredness of tradition and inherited custom, and not excluding the French postmodern cry, vive la différence. Accordingly, the Arab regimes claim that just as Dutch and Norwegian democracy differ from French democracy, and American democracy differs from the British and Indian democracies, our Arab kind of democracy naturally differs from the rest as well. And no one has the right to contest or criticize our right to be different. That is, again, vive la différence. As against the security democracy scene of the top dogs of the Arab world, there is at present a quasi-consensus working itself out in key Arab countries and societies, accompanied by wide-ranging debates and sharp controversies over the importance and relevance of such values, practices, and arrangements as some respect for human rights, let me again repeat, a measure of democratic rule, an active civil society, citizenship, the secularity of the state and its apparatuses, the freedoms of conscience, of thought and expression, all for breaking out of the current predicaments of stagnation, arrest, corruption, decay, and further civil strife that evidently engulf the entire Arab world at the present time. This consensus or quasi-consensus is very serious for us at this time and is not to be taken lightly either by us or by others. So I will proceed to make a number of hopefully significant observations concerning this consensus. First, this consensus relies on and embodies a set of values, practices, principles, and arrangements that are admittedly of modern European origin and provenance, conventionally attributed and traced back to the Enlightenment. And everyone is conscious that these values and principles have indisputably come to acquire by now a universal global significance that has turned them into a common human good and into today's compelling and pervasive normative paradigm on all matters pertaining to rights, citizenship, human dignity, democracy, civil society, government accountability, and so on. Let me emphasize here that the modest, localized European origins of this modern model do not detract, in our view, from its later paradigmatic universality, any more than the humble rise of Islam, for example, in two insignificant desert towns on the edge of the Roman Empire detracted from its consequent universality and sweep. Similar things may be said about the relationship of Christianity's equally modest and localized origins in a neglected and despised district of the same Roman Empire to its subsequent paradigmatic universality, hegemony, and comprehensiveness. Second, it is most interesting to note that at present, the Arab violators of the values and principles of both this worldwide paradigm as well as of our local quasi-consensus based on this paradigm find it necessary as never before to pay some public and official lip service to its principles for purposes of self-legitimation and of self-justification, both nationally, regionally, and internationally. This is certainly an indication, again, of the legitimacy, strength, and efficacy that this emerging consensus has achieved even in the eyes of its enemies. In fact, experience has shown that the moment these enemies fall prey to the persecution of their own enemies, the first thing they appeal to in self-defense are, for example, the idea of an independent judiciary and the recognized universal principles of human rights, with plenty of emphasis on their universality and inclusiveness. In fact, the very production of such official schemes as the charters of Islamic, African, Chinese, and Hindu human rights forms an added testimony to the truth that the original paradigm of human rights has acquired the dual status of a common human good and of the global compelling normative model for passing judgment on all these matters and these issues. As a consequence, the traditional Arab left, including the communist parties, has by and large come to rally around this consensus and its values and principles, and to give them pride of place in all their programs, demands, and manifestos. that was not sheer opportunism on the part of the left in the Arab world. 4, this left had thought of itself as working and struggling for modern, socialist, secular, economically developed, and socially just Arab societies. With the collapse of the socialist idea, of socialist movements and states everywhere, the only avenue open to the left seemed like a retreat to the second line of defense, namely a rallying around the well-known classical bourgeois values issuing from the French Revolution, and now locally embodied in the current Arab quasi-consensus that I spoke about. This consensus has to be defended against the arbitrariness and tyranny of dictatorial regimes armed with martial law and its instruments of oppression and repression, as well as against the advancing medievalism, obscurantism, and theocratism of the Islamists and fundamentalists. The supposed rational center of society, represented by the middle classes, think of themselves anyway as the natural bearers and implementers of this kind of consensus. Even the Muslim Brothers organizations, the right wing of the political spectrum, have reluctantly come around to make themselves openly a part of this consensus. For example, Egypt's Society of Muslim Brothers, after decades of insisting, like the Saudi monarchy, on the claim that the Quran is their constitution, on the imperative of restoring the Muslim caliphate, and on the immediate application of Sharia law, made public not too long ago its official initiative and formal program for the comprehensive reform of Egyptian state, society, and economy, calling for the rejection of the idea of a religious state and government in favor of what it now calls a civil government. The Muslim Brothers' euphemism for a secular or at least a religiously neutral kind of state and state apparatuses. This reform program, announced by the mother of all fundamentalisms in the Arab world and beyond, has come around to call for popular sovereignty, representative democracy, the circulation of power, free, honest, and transparent popular election, the separation of powers, an independent judiciary, empowerment of civil society, empowerment of women, respect for human rights, citizens' civil rights and liberties, freedom of conscience, freedom of religious belief, worship and practice for all, and freedom of thought and expression. The Muslim Brothers in Syria produced a very similar document representing their own initiative and program for the comprehensive reform of Syrian state, society, and economy. Actually, reading these documents feels at times like something out of Diderot or Montesquieu. This account is not meant to be a judgment on either the Muslim Brothers' sincerity or earnestness or good faith in genuinely adhering to such a program in the foreseeable future, but is meant only as an added testimony to the increasing inescapability and continuing effectiveness of this consensus in and with such most unlikely quarters as the Muslim brother organizations of Egypt and Syria. Recent developments in Turkey form an equally instructive instance in this case, particularly for the Arab world, considering first that the Arab world is the heartland of Islam, and second, considering the deep-seated Arabocentrism of Arabs concerning anything that has to do with Islam, and where the silent premise is always, if you are not Arab and Sunni, then your Islam is either suspect or flawed. It is certainly noteworthy that Turkey, the only Muslim country with a developed and explicit secular ideology, tradition, and practice, should be also the only major Muslim society to produce a democratic Muslim political party, something like Europe's Christian democratic parties, capable of ascending to power without a catastrophe befalling the whole polity, as has happened elsewhere. This novel development put everyone concerned before the following paradox. As is well known, the currently ruling Islamic party there is the most eager proponent and promoter of Turkey's membership in the European Union, a Christian club, as ex-President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing of France once called it. At the same time, the Turkish military establishment, traditionally the staunchest guardian of Turkish secularism and the bastion of its Kemalist experiment, is now the most important obstructor of Turkey's membership in the secular European Union. What are we to make of this paradox? It is clear to me, at least, that this Turkish Muslim Democratic Party hopes that EU membership will help put an end to the military's traditional meddling in the affairs of the Turkish state. The army generals know this very well and react accordingly by doing their best to delay and obstruct the process for as long as possible. This is why I think the EU would do all parties concerned a great favor and an enduring service by continuing to take Turkey by the hand and helping it through this difficult and risky transition period, pretty much the way the European Union had helped Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland to overcome their troubled fascist, militaristic, authoritarian, and priest-ridden pasts, respectively. Certainly, Turkish membership in the EU would make it almost impossible for the military there to revert to type and distort their country's fragile democracy. It would also make it just as difficult for any Islamic party or coalition of such parties to revert to type in the future and ruin Turkey's promising new experiment by one form or another of Muslim fundamentalism, scripturalism, and literalism. Both the Arab world and Islam in general are now in dire need of a reasonably free, democratic, and secular model that works in a Muslim society. Turkey is at the moment the most likely place for such a model to develop and mature, given the assistance of the EU membership and the safeguards it provides. In other words, what we need here is a credible, functioning counterexample to the failed Muslim Taliban instance that the United States left us with in Afghanistan not too long ago, with all its horrors and deformities. Not to be missed either are the very significant reactions to the current Turkish paradox and example in the Arab world, the heartland of Islam, as I said. Allow me to explain myself on this. It is well known that the Arab left traditionally hated Turkey on account of A, its close alliance with the West throughout the Cold War, B, its full membership in NATO, C, its staunch opposition to the Soviet Union and to communism in general, and D, its recognition of and friendly relations with Israel. This same Arab left has come around now to see in Turkey the only Muslim country where some of the values of the secular consensus that the Arab left has come to strongly emphasize and promote have taken root, appear to function comparatively well, and seem to have a future. I have certainly watched with wonder Syrian leftist friends, colleagues, and old-timers publicly praising the Turkish democratic experiment and looking up to it for possible benefit, instruction, and emulation, while knowing full well that these same persons had spent their entire careers denouncing the Turkish state's politics, alliances, programs, and all that it once stood for during the Cold War. This instance is particularly telling given the fact that the old Arab animosities towards Turkey, Syria's northern neighbor, remained most acute, persistent, and frank in Syria itself. Similarly, the mainstream Arab Islamists, who traditionally despised modern Turkey and denounced it for its abolition of the caliphate, its Kemalism, secularism, nationalism, and Westernism, have also come around to see in the evolution and maturation of contemporary Turkish political Islam to the point of democratically and peacefully assuming power as a model for the direction in which the Arab world failed political Islam should now go. For example, I have noted the phenomenon of outspoken Islamist critics and commentators publicly castigating the Muslim Brothers organization in Egypt for its total mental laziness, political sterility, and organizational inertia over the last 30 years, all in light of what political Islam has been able to achieve in Turkey. Furthermore, I am confident that, had it not been for the Turkish example, the Muslim Brothers would have never had the will and the cheek to produce the kind of advanced programs of reform for Egypt and Syria that they recently announced, as I pointed out. The Arab nationalists traditionally condemned Turkey, not only for many of the reasons adduced by the leftists and Islamists, but also on account of A, lingering resentments against the young Turks' early policies of Turkification in the remaining Arab provinces of the old empire, and B, of their eagerness to blame Arab backwardness and failings on what they call the long retrograde Turkish occupation of the Arab lands. They don't even call it Ottoman. This condemnation has always been more severe and vociferous among Syria's Arab and other kinds of nationalists because of the loss of some northern coastal territories to Turkey, and next under the French Mandate regime shortly before the Second World War. Even these nationalists have come around to a new and different look at present-day Turkey. For they see now that, unlike their own brand of Arab nationalism, the Turkish variety of nationalism proved to be a success story on the whole. They have come to admit that the earlier strategic decisions and historical choices that they once despised so keenly on the part of the Turks seem at the moment to have served reasonably well the Turkish national interest, something that can in no way be said about comparable Arab nationalist choices, decisions, and outcomes. The Arab nationalists are actually jealous of the fact that all the things they had wanted for their own nation seem at present to be much better fulfilled in a neighboring Middle Eastern Muslim society for which they had no use before. But now I find them giving open and public advice to themselves and to others about the lessons to be drawn and learned from the overall Turkish nationalist experience and experiment in state, society, and economy. During the United States preparations for the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003, the Turkish parliament rejected an American request to station troops on Turkish soil. The US administration had to swallow that rejection because it emanated from a genuine parliament, freely and democratically elected, and not even the angry and bellicose Bush administration and team could raise any doubts about the Turkish parliament's legitimacy and representative credentials. In the Arab world, this Turkish stance was highly esteemed and admired at the popular level, and the following telling argument was put forward. What Arab king, what Arab president or ruler could go to the President of the United States and tell him, my parliament rejected your government's request, without the American president either laughing him off the stage or even yelling back at him, go to hell you and your parliament. We know what kind of an assembly you have at your disposal. Let me conclude by making some observations about present-day Iraq on account of their relevance to my analysis, as well as an illustration of some of the points I made. And I'll start by asking the question: can this currently tortured Arab country, known as Iraq, stay intact without somehow reaching an agreement, explicitly or implicitly, among the religious communities, sects, factions, and fractions forming its population, that accepts without reservations a state and a form of government that could be called by some secular, by others civil, and still by others religiously neutral? All this as a precondition for any kind of democratic procedures to function there, even minimally. My answer to this question is a flat no. So let me share with you now the following hypothetical mental experiment, an experiment in ideal types, as Max Weber would put it. Suppose that the people of currently occupied Iraq hold a General Assembly under the tight supervision of the United States and its allies there, through real and genuine representatives of all the communities of faith and ethnicities making up the people of Iraq: Shias, Sunnis, Kurds, Christians, Zoroastrians, Sabi'a, Majus, and what have you, to save the unity and integrity of their country, to prevent it from sliding into a ruinous confessional war, and to agree on a form of state and government that is minimally acceptable to all the parties involved, as well as to the majority of the Iraqi people. Let me ask then, what kind of concessions the parties to this assembly have to make to each other, have to make to the supervising power, and have to make to the rest of the watching world in order to save the new Iraq from the worst case scenarios? I suggest the following. First, the Muslim communities have to explicitly retract all the Sharia law rules and regulations traditionally governing the Ahl al-Dhimma in the country. The Ahl al-Dhimma being the traditionally protected minority of traditional Islam, mainly Christians and Jews. Retract them de jure once and for all, and not just de facto, as is presently the case in most Arab states. This will involve the frank and open admission that the Sharia principles governing the protégés of Islam have lapsed and become inoperative, just like all those other Sharia rules and regulations that once governed slavery in Islam and in Muslim societies and polities. Short of such a measure, the Iraqi state will never become a state for all Iraq's citizens. And this is a precondition, in my view, for any form of democratic rule, even in the minimalist sense of the term. Second, the Muslim communities have to abolish, once and for all, the archaic Islamic penal code, inflicting such punishments as flogging, death by stoning, the amputation of limbs, and similar forms of bodily torture and mutilation. This is all the more urgent now, given the revulsion generated in the country and beyond by the barbaric penalties meted out even to minor transgressors by Saddam Hussein's regime and his henchmen, such as plucking out eyes, cutting off ears, removing noses, and pulling out tongues. 3, the Muslim communities in Iraq have to shun and reject, in no uncertain terms, the kind of Islam that is obsessed by a view of the outside and inside worlds as full of nothing but damned infidels, kafirs, unbelievers, pagans, apostates, polytheists, mushriks, heretics, atheists, hypocrites, zindiqs, rawafid, rejectionists, all to be dealt with accordingly, including such smaller offshoots of Islam as the Alawis, the Ismailis, the Druzes, the Baha'is, the Ahmadis, and so on. This means putting an end, once and for all, to the now resurrected exclusive traditional Muslim division of the world into the house of Islam as against the house of war, the house of faith and belief as against the house of kufr and unbelief. 4, the Shia community has to retract everything pertaining to the imami form of rule, vilayat al-faqih type of government, deputy of the imam kind of theocracy, with all their implications and possible applications. Otherwise, the Iraqi government will never be a government of and for all Iraq's citizens. 5, the numerical Shia majority has to acknowledge and commit itself to the principle that democracy does not mean majority rule only, but majority rule and minority rights at one and the same time, with all the built-in mechanisms, checks, and balances that help prevent any majority from turning into a tyranny against itself, a tyranny against its own people in general, and against its minorities in particular. 6, the final Muslim abolition de jure, and not just de facto, of the status of women as a awra in Islam, that is as something to be ashamed of, to be hidden and covered like a scandal, or else all official and formal declarations of the equality of women and men in the new Iraq will remain fundamentally flawed and shamefully hollow. Finally, in a recent public debate in Damascus on some of these issues, I put forward a certain proposal concerning the Sunni-Shia struggle and fight in Iraq and elsewhere, and I would like to end now by reporting to you on that proposal. I said then that, having seen the Russians apologize to the Polish, Hungarian, Czech, and Slovak peoples for past wrongs, having seen the whites in South Africa apologize to the black majority for the past injuries of apartheid, having seen the Japanese apologize to the Koreans for past persecutions, having heard of Arab petitions submitted to the Pope, pleading for an apology to the Muslim, Arab, and Eastern Christian worlds for the wrong of the Crusades, and having learned of the Pope's positive responses to such petitions, I pleaded in my own turn with the Sunni religious leaderships in Iraq and everywhere else to apologize to the Shia of Iraq and beyond for the unspeakable crime of the murder of the Prophet's grandson Al-Hussein in the Karbala massacre in the year 61 of the Muslim calendar. And just as the Pope had absolved and forgiven Jewish posterity from the blood of Jesus Christ, I pleaded with the Shia clerical establishment in Iraq and everywhere else to absolve and forgive Sunni posterity from the blood spilled in Karbala, that mother of all Muslim crimes. Thank you very much.
We'll let those of you who have other commitments and classes take your leave. I'll explain it. I'll explain the format we're going to use. If you want to come up closer, you're more than welcome to. We don't have a handheld mic for the questions, so we're going to ask you to do one of two things. Okay. The first thing is, if you want to just stand and state your question, I'll be happy to restate it through the mic. We're taping, and so we'd really like your questions to be understood. The other thing is, you're more than welcome to come up here and form lines to ask your question at this microphone. So whatever you'd like. Do you want to stand up, give us your name and your major?
I'm Peter Snyder. I'm a political science major. You mentioned the fact that the EU should take Turkey by the hand in order to help it through this transition period. I was wondering exactly what specific policies the EU would use in order to take Turkey by the hand, and what specific ways they could help them. And also, if similar things could be done with other Arab nations that may be going through some kind of transition.
Okay. The question is how the.
I got it.
Can we restate it for the tape?
Sorry.
The question is how the EU could be of use to both Turkey and possibly other Arab states in terms of helping facilitate democracy for them.
Well, I on purpose used the phrase "take Turkey by the hand" in order not to prejudge the debate that is going on now within the European Union, within Turkey, on the feasibility of joining the European Union and how long it will take and so on. Even if it were to take, say, another 10 years, it is very important, in my view, for the European Union to continue in one form or another the association and patronage and assistance to Turkey to be able to make this transition. Now, specifically, what kind of determined policies to follow? Of course, I have no way of either telling or predicting. My hope is that there will be no rupture in this, because I think it will react negatively, not just on Turkish and Turkish relationship, but to affect the whole Islamic world, the Arab world, and so on. In the case of Arab states, I think this is not on the agenda in any reasonable sense or any possible sense right now, because none of the Arab states have gone through anything similar to the Turkish experience and experiment. We have had certainly in places like Syria, Egypt, Algeria, and so on, definitely secularizing movements. But these have been slow, hesitant, absorbent, with lots of retreats in them, but there never was in the Arab states and the Arab societies developed a real crystallized movement of secularization with its ideology, apparatuses, parties, army, and so on. This is really unique to Turkey, and we in the Arab world lack this aspect of the Turkey. So the idea of somehow an Arab country like Syria or Egypt re-holding itself in order to be eligible to enter the European Union is very, very far-fetched at present.
My name is Jason Cabating, and I'm a Latin American Studies major. My question is, what policy recommendations would you make to the United States in order to help build democracy in the Middle East in general?
Well, sometimes when I'm in Damascus, it seems it's the best policy is that for the Americans to keep quiet about democracy, not to say very much. Because there is so much cynicism and so much disbelief and so much conviction that democracy, human rights, and so on, when they are promoted on a very selective basis at the service of certain policies that have power behind them, or oil, or something like that. This is a very widespread point of view, and it moves people's attitudes, people's demonstrations, and so on. But this does not mean that the opposition forces, in other words, the democratic opposition, say in Egypt or Syria, the civil society movements and so on, may not indirectly benefit from the fact that the United States is, say, putting some pressure on the Egyptian regime, of the Syrian regime, okay, to at least look a little bit better on questions of human rights and so on. This is not declared, but implicitly it is appreciated. It is regarded as a moment that can be used by the democratic opposition, by civil society, in order perhaps to widen the margin a bit. Okay. But beyond that, I don't think now there is much that can be done. Certainly, any financing of organizations or institutions and so on in the Arab world directly by, say, the United States government would be very, very suspect, and actually would be counterproductive completely, and would be used by the regime in order to discredit those who make those connections.
My name is Sean Henretta. I'm an international relations major. And my question is difficult to form, but I'll try my best. In our terrorism studies class, we were studying about Saudi Arabia in general and how the Saud family is trying to make certain reforms, but they're doing it slowly because they're afraid that radical or fundamentalist parties might take advantage of this opening up of the government to overthrow that government in power. So if you were a policy expert or analyst, what recommendations would you make to, say, Saudi Arabia or to any Muslim country in general that's trying to open up but is trying to prevent fundamentalist Islamists from taking advantage of this sort of détente or opening up?
Well, in a way, it's good you chose, for example, Saudi Arabia, because, and it's interesting the way you put it, is that the Saudi monarchy is afraid that if it opens up, fundamentalist forces will take over. As if you spoke as if the regime or the monarchy in Saudi Arabia is not the most fundamentalist that we have in the Islamic world, okay? And of course, it's an enormity that we should have fundamentalism to the right of something like Saudi Arabia. Throughout the Cold War, okay, Saudi Arabia was regarded as the limit in terms of a fundamentalism and in terms of a regime that can be fundamentalist. And it was, of course, throughout and continues to be one of the closest allies of the United States. And it was that fundamentalism that spread a lot of money, spread the kind of Islamic ideology that emanates from there in practically every other Arab country, whether it be Morocco or Syria or Lebanon, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. They spread it, and it is that which led to an even more extreme form, which even the Saudis now are scared of on this. And you are quite right on this, that the Saudis are scared of it, and the Saudis, when they were advised long ago by even elements in the system, okay, someone like Yemeni, who was, say, the Minister of Oil and so on, to tinker with the system to make it a little bit more in sync with the way Saudi Arabia has developed. They kept refusing, and now what I see is that any tinkering with the system, you see, is going to lead to a disaster, and even if you don't do anything, it may lead to a disaster, and the fact that the country is very rich, okay, at least financially, certainly economically, and can buy themselves, buy time for themselves, and so on, of course, helps, okay. But I really don't see, a solution in Saudi Arabia, okay, that can. The best thing they can do is probably try to continue tinkering a bit in lessening the traditional fundamentalism that controls. Okay? But at the same time, see, this fundamentalism a lot of people who take it seriously and look around their society, okay, they say they hate the hypocrisy, because the pretenses are one thing. I mean, the gap between the pretenses and the way actually the substance of Saudi society is so big, right, that you had in 1979 the children of the system, okay, rebelling, occupying. I don't know if you know the incident. Okay, they occupied the Haram, okay, the Meccan shrine, and nothing in Islam could be more earth-shaking than an act like that, declaring the Mahdi. And what were they saying? They were telling the Saudi monarchy, okay, everything you taught us, you see, we want to apply. You are not applying. You are failing with it. And this is, I think, this is, the situation that leads to that rebellion is increasing. And you can see Bin Laden, you see, as almost like the leader of the Haram insurrection, whose name was Juhayman al-Utaybi. Okay, as Juhayman al-Utaybi, okay, Gun International. So this would be my, comment on Saudi Arabia, but I don't see any easy way out really for them.
My name is Ryan Allgood, and I'm a Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic major. And my question has to do with the political debate surrounding Iraq. One aspect of that is the question of engaging Syria and engaging Iran in helping to stabilize Iraq. And my question for you is, do you think that would be a positive that would help or would detract from the stabilization of Iraq if America were to start engaging more with Syria and Iran on those questions?
Okay, good. First of all, I remember in Damascus I met David Satterfield in a discussion, and I met John Kerry, okay, also in a discussion. And among the points that came up, one of the points that came out, I said, and this was not too long ago, I said, I've studied in the United States, I taught there, I followed, policy in the Middle East, I learned how policy is made and decisions are made in the United States. And I see that this administration is violating everything I read in the political science books in Columbia University and Yale and all these good places I went. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, according to what these books said, is that first of all, if you don't put a policy that would take on at one and the same time, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, okay, at that time Pakistan was also, involved, okay, you have a set of priorities, which means, according to those books, is that, say, if you want the Shia in Iraq to remain cooperative, you don't go about pushing Iran so hard. Okay, you maybe push it later. Okay, but first, or if you want to placate the Sunnah in Iraq, you do something for the Palestinians. Okay, but taking them all at the same time, okay, is it doable? Okay. Well, we had some discussion. I think this is at the core of the problem, and in the background to your question. Okay, is whether for the earlier policy of Bush the father, okay, of having created a big coalition to liberate Kuwait, and which was completely scrapped, during the occupation or the invasion of Iraq. But that's that. Now, how about now? The attitude in Syria now, okay, is we have a lot of highly mobilized, committed fundamentalists, okay, and they want to do something. Well, let them go to Iraq. Let the Americans kill them. Why should we do it? Okay, let them go. And if on the way they kill a few Americans, that's not bad too. Okay, so it's a win-win situation for the Syrian regime right now. And of course, Iran is thinking, similarly about it, playing various Shia groups against each other and so on, making life difficult for the American troops. Now, I must say that whether, say, a new president in the United States to open negotiations, say, with Syria to help on this. In Syria, I would say a lot of people have a divided soul on this. Okay, on the one hand, this would be good for Syria. Okay, it would make up for past injuries and so on. It would give some leverage to Syria, say on the Golan, the question of the Golan Heights and Palestine and etc. But also it would, strengthen the regime and the iron hand of the regime. That's the, downside of it. Okay, this. Yeah. Okay, if the part of the arguments of the opposition, okay, is that internally to the regime is that if you are quarreling with the Saudis, quarreling with the Egyptians, quarreling with the Americans. I mean, just like President Bush taking on everybody at the same time, okay, and that of course gives strength and credibility to the democratic opposition, to the civil society movement, okay, telling them, who do you think you are? You can take on all these at the same time. So if there is a break in this, and the United States starts talking to the Syrian regime and again cooperation and so on, that would weaken the position of the opposition. But all in all, I think, in terms of, I would say, general Arab interest, and of course for poor Iraq and so on, I would support some kind of dialogue between Syria and the United States to resolve at least as many of the outstanding issues as possible. When John Kerry was in Damascus and were debating this, discussing some of these things at the dinner in the embassy, and Margaret Scobie was the ambassador then, and then in the discussion, I asked John Kerry. I said, okay, all these things the Americans want, all right, what do we get in return? Okay, what would you give us? And he didn't say anything, but the ambassador said, and I used, when I said this, I said, okay, you are in international relations. I mean, yourself as a student. I said, these things are quid pro quo. I used the Latin phrase. And Margaret Scobie replied by saying, there is no quid pro quo. And I said, but this is the end of politics and the end of diplomacy if there is no quid pro quo. Okay, that was the now. This attitude of no quid pro quo hopefully would be broken. Okay, and there will be again politics and diplomacy going on.
Can I, just a follow up?
Yeah.
What would the role be? What role would Syria or Iran play in the stabilization of Iraq if they were to be engaged?
Oh, I think they can play big roles, especially, of course, Iran even a bigger role. Okay, I think a lot of the fighting and violence and so on could decrease immensely if both states reach a deal with the United States.
Should we do one more question? We'll do one more fast question.
My name is Max Stoneman. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. And I wanted to ask you your suggestions for Iraq at the end of your presentation. A lot of those had to do with the Iraqis themselves. And with General Petraeus giving testimony in Congress right now, I wanted to ask you if you felt that America's presence in Iraq was necessary for your suggestions to be implemented, and if so, how much influence could America have in seeing that happen?
Well, I think openly America should not interfere in that. That's an internal Arab, Muslim, Iraqi affair that has to be worked out. But certainly America can play the role of facilitator, the play of catalyst, and so on. I don't know if it is at all on their agenda, this, at least implicitly, or a secret agenda or something, if they are aware that these are needed, these things. In other words, if you put them together, okay, you have to ask what concessions they have to make to each other, okay? And I give at least my list of the kind of concessions they have to make each other for a stable arrangement, and not to quarrel over, who will have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and who will have the Ministry of Internal Affairs, okay, like we are having now in Lebanon right now. So I think the Americans can be facilitators, can be catalysts, and at the same time, there will be an imperceptible factor working with the Iraqis, okay, in this, is wanting to show, okay, the rest of the world, wanting to show the European Union, wanting to show the Americans that we can make concessions to each other and make it on our own. Okay, that will be a very strong motive, an important one. If you jumpstart such a process.
Let us thank Professor Al-Azm for sharing his wisdom with us.